This second and last section, which is a bit longer, is from a much more successful period of Joe's life and career, and the career of the Clash. In July 1978, I joined the group in Manchester on the On Parole tour. In the few days since I'd seen the Clash in Fulham in London, where they'd played a warm-up date, the change in Joe was marked. He seemed very much at the end of his tether. Driven by Joe's demonic urgency, the gigs I saw were the best, the warmest, the most involving, the most enjoyable rock and roll shows I had ever seen. As the Clash had progressed to playing theatre-sized shows, each with an audience of around 3,000 people, Joe had risen as a performer. These larger stages offered him far more room to move around as he performed his visionary act. But his role as frontman seemed to be taking an exponential, psychological, even psychic toll on him. The moodiness and edginess I had previously observed had returned. Being Joe Strummer, which meant leading the punk masses back to the hotel each night like some anti-Pied Piper, was a 24-hour job. Joe Strummer never closed, and you could see the stress that lurks permanently behind that superficially benign stoned countenance. In Manchester, the afternoon after the Apollo show, and a few hours before an unscheduled gig at Rafters nightclub on this day off, the Clash had gone out to pick up some new music at a local branch of HMV. Mick had bought cassettes of Pt.2's Legalize It, Al Green's Let's Stay Together, Neil Young's On the Beach, and Randy Newman's Little Criminals, which gave a sense of how broad was his taste and his influences from the influences from his end on the group. On the way back to their hotel, we had passed a piece of Manchester United graffiti, which, through a further graffiti add-on, had transmuted into MU, Manchester United, MUNF, about the best piece of artwork they'll ever manage, Joe had laughed contemptuously. Later, Mick Jones and I had been sitting up in Joe's hotel room, watching a highly emotive World in Action, that's a documentary series, expose of the National Front, when a tense Joe Strummer had walked in. For maybe 2 or 3 minutes he stood scowling at the programme. "Did you talk to Bernie about all those problems with the fan club?" Mick Jones inquired. In a sudden spasm of rage, Joe took a vicious kick at a metal waste paper basket, which flew up into the air. A broken cassette inside it just missing my head, and the Clash's front man stormed out. Again, Joe being rather frightening. A concerned Mick Jones followed him out of the room and found the reason he was so wound up was because he had been told it would be difficult getting kids into the Rafters gig for nothing, a perennial problem for Joe, of course. Joe's mood swings could seem almost out of control and utterly unpredictable. In the dressing room before the Glasgow performance that followed the Manchester dates, he came up to me. "Sandwich, you're an intelligent man," he said with a benign smile. "So could you tape this up for me, please?" He produced some pieces of cotton that he wrapped around his right wrist and about which I wound gaffer tape. This was what became known as the Strummer Guard, Joe's own invention to prevent his wrist from being sliced apart during his frantic chord slashing on his Telecaster. But in that same Glasgow Apollo dressing room after the show, he grabbed by the throat a fan who was berating him for not having done more to stop the demented bouncers. Glasgow's Apollo Theatre was notorious on the gig circuit for the excessive violence its psychotic bouncers employed. During the Clash's show, these bouncers indiscriminately pummeled, clubbed and kicked the audience, who of course retaliated. Joe, wearing a t-shirt that read, "Get to fuck," backed off from the mic and shook his head to himself after pleading with the bouncers and the kids to stop attempting to dismember each other. "Simmer down, control your temper," which in the heat of the moment, few probably recognized as a pair of lines from Bob Marley's 1964 Jamaican hit, "Simmer Down." When he finally gave up, leaving the stage in tears, a whiskey-fumed bouncer stepped forward. "We're gonna have you," he leered at Joe. Rumours quickly swirled that the bouncers were heading for the group's dressing room, determined to kick the shit out of them. The Clash left the Apollo, me with them, glad to be away from the place, except that we were met outside by aggrieved fans, complaining that Joe and the others stood by and watched while they were massacred. "You're just big-egoed pop stars," snarled one. Exasperated, Joe slammed the lemonade bottle he was carrying onto the ground. As it shattered, police materialized as if from nowhere and heavy-handedly grabbed Joe to sweep him into one of their vans. Paul Simonon stepped forward to protest, and for his pains was viciously cracked across the skull by a truncheon, before also being thrown into a van. Topper Hedden wisely disappeared. Mick and myself, together with Johnny Green, raced off in the direction of the hotel to hide Joe and Paul's drugs in case the police searched their rooms. The next day, Joe and Paul appeared in court, charged with breach of the peace. Joe's brush with the law gave his Brando slouch in the dock real credibility. He was fined £25, Paul £45. "What is the name of your group?" inquired the magistrate. "The Clash," mumbled Joe. "How appropriate," tittered the magistrate. In the street outside the court, Joe Strummer turned to Paul Simonon and grinned. "Maybe it was a mistake calling this the Clash on Parole Tour." As the Ford Granada purred out of Glasgow with Johnny Green at the wheel, on our way to their next gig in Aberdeen, 150 miles to the northeast, relaxing spliffs were produced to take the edge off the general trauma of the previous night. Joe slotted a copy in the vehicle's cassette player of Trout Mask Replica, the most avant-garde and difficult work by his beloved Captain Beefheart and the Magic Band. Hardly the best driving music. "Here, what's that? It's horrible! Take it off!" demanded Paul Simonon. The journey through the Scottish Highlands passed without further incident, and after some hours we hit the oil boomtown of Aberdeen. Although it was July, it was freezing cold, a bitter wind billowing off the North Sea. At a roadside stop, Mick Jones took out of his suitcase a brown World War II German Army leather coat he had bought in Camden Market and put it on. Everyone said I was stupid to bring this, but I knew I'd need it. With Joe sitting in the front seat, we drove straight to the venue for the sound check. I was sitting between Mick and Paul in the back seat. Johnny Green, the tour manager, pulled up to open the gate in the metal link fencing that enclosed the rear entrance, leaving the engine running. As he pinned the gate open against the fence, Joe, always up for a prank, ho-ho, leapt into the driver's seat. Although he couldn't drive, he knew how an automatic car worked. Slotting the stick into the drive position, he seized the steering wheel and pressed his foot down on the accelerator, clearly intending to whiz past Johnny by inches, startling him. Except, as I said, Joe couldn't drive. He misjudged by a few inches and pinned Johnny Green against the fence, the right edge of the car's nose lodging in the metal links. Johnny screamed in pain. The full weight of the Ford was against him. Joe was now panicking. He didn't know what to do. Although he had taken his foot off the accelerator, the automatic was still in gear and was edging slowly forward against the fence, crushing Johnny. "I can't breathe, my ribs are breaking," he screamed. Afterwards, Mick Jones said he went on a bit, didn't he? Horror descended upon everyone's face as everything went into slow motion. From where I was, I could see that Joe had gone white and tears were forming in his eyes, which Johnny confirmed many years later when we talked about this. Mick Jones acted quickly. In his German Army leather coat, he jumped out of the car and ran for help. Paul raced to the front of the Granada, hopelessly trying to push it back. I could drive and realised what needed to be done. "Joe, get in the passenger seat," I told him. Slipping through the gap between the two front seats, I got behind the wheel. I yanked the wheel to the right and put the gear lever into the reverse position. The car moved backwards and off Johnny, who staggered forward, gulping for air, clutching his ribs. In shock, Joe and I looked at each other. "Thanks, Sandwich," he said, and looked away, his eyes still rheumy, his skin ashen. Mick Jones arrived with a rescue party, half a dozen 13-year-old kids on skateboards. But they were not needed in this story of the rock and roll wars. As I said, I'd already felt on this tour that Joe Strummer was a man at the end of his tether. I felt unspecifically but deeply worried for him. We never again mentioned the Aberdeen car incident, Joe and I. Not that there was anything unmentionable about it, but simply because everything was happening so instantly that it somehow seemed almost quite normal. In the Aberdeen hotel after the show, I went up to Joe's room with him. Waterloo by ABBA wafted through the window from the hotel's disco. "That's a good one," said Joe. He told me the occasional losses of control I'd witnessed on the road were due to unrelenting pressure. But, as Joe himself admitted, in the past they were down to the demon drink. He said this problem was solved when his hepatitis, which he'd got about 6 months previously, obliged him to lay off booze. "It doesn't half make you lose your friends, though, not going down the pub," he laughed. But he also, untruthfully, vigorously denied the hepatitis was due to any ingestion of stimulating powders. Joe had a very powerful aura about him. On stage, he never smiled. This hard man stage persona, you realise, might well have been an extension of the belligerent Scotsman within him, something I hadn't known until he revealed it that night. As he leant back against the headboard of his hotel bed, it was apparent what a very sensitive and perceptive bloke he was. All the time, he told me, underlining something Mick Jones had said earlier in the day, he kept getting signs, whether in the form of actual emissaries or less tangible incidents, that he and the group were on the right path. "I'm going for that mumbo-jumbo a lot," he smiled. "Like, when me and Mick went to Jamaica, I was quite convinced we were going to die. At Heathrow, someone dropped this ketchup all over the floor in front of us. And then when we get there, and we're driving through Trenchtown, I glance up at this wall and see this one word, blood. Mind you, nothing happened at all like that. And when I got back, I thought, what a lot of time I wasted worrying." We talked about the contradictions within the Clash, how the warmth and positivism were hemmed in by overtly aggressive imagery, the gun logo, the militaristic stage backdrops, even the new song titles. "Tommy gun, guns on the roof. It keeps coming up, doesn't it?" Joe nodded. "I think it's just a reflection of what's out there. I really do think we're a good force, but we're dealing with the world, and those images are just a reflection of what it is." We discussed the paradox between his serious intent and the fact that so many Clash listeners seem to miss out on the humour in their lyrics. I told him there were certain tracks on the first album that made me burst out laughing every time I heard them. "Yeah," he smiled, "I think some of it's really hysterical stuff. We all used to burst out laughing too when we first started playing them." I mentioned Mick Jones told me he'd found it a strain when people tried to look on the group as evangelists. "Yeah, that's a bore, just a load of old crap. I think you've always just got to be grateful for what you've achieved and then just try and achieve some more." But why did he think the group had got to the position where people thought the Clash had the answer? "We give them good stuff, that's all. There aren't that many other groups around doing it." So look, I concluded, it's 2 years on from when the group first started. How does it feel now? I could have told you the answer without hearing the question. We're a good group. That's the only answer. And when you're in a good group, you feel good. Causing mayhem throughout the land, there was a notable stage invasion by skinheads when the group played in Crawley in Sussex. The Clash on Parole tour continued until it wound up with 4 nights at the Music Machine in Camden Town. Joe made an impression on one Gabby Salter, whom he had already met at a Christmas party. Late on a hot July night, when the Clash had played one of their Music Machine dates, Alex Chetwynd, a family friend of Gabby's, came across her at a bus stop in Notting Hill Gate, waiting with a chum for a night bus. "We've just been to see the Clash. Oh, that great Joe Strummer is so gorgeous," Gabby sighed to Alex. "But his teeth are disgusting," said her pal. Thanks. That's it.